be joining us from, and be it live or asynchronous, welcome. My name is Michelle Haynes-Baratz. I am a Managing Associate at Community Science, and I am so glad that you are here with me to talk about data, why purpose and context matters. So I know that the world is a busy and very swirling place. I don't take lightly that you've chosen to spend some of your precious time with me, and my sincere hope is that it will feel like time well spent. So this is the final session of our three-part webinar series on strengthening strategy and impact during uncertain times. Hopefully you've had a chance to tune in previously and hear from my amazing colleagues. We had Amber Trout, who kicked us off with a session on sustaining momentum when everything seems urgent. How do we keep going and working towards that long game? And then we heard from the wise Jasmine Williams-Washington, who invited us to reimagine capacity building as a holistic approach and means to achieve strategic alignment as we work towards lasting change. So today I'm going to round out the conversation by talking through the measurement process. That is, as we're building, as we're moving through, how can we measure what matters so that we know what's working, what's not, and where we might need to pivot. So some takeaways for today. Data is a tool. It is a means to an end. It is not the end and of itself. Important to remember. Takeaway number 2, there is no one way, there is no right answer in terms of what one should measure or how to measure it. Rather, context matters deeply. And last but not least, your data strategy needs to match the moment and your horizon of change. And this really has to do with thinking about change over time. So before we dive into our conversation about data, let me introduce you to community science. I am but one of many voices of our collective, and I'm very grateful to have my colleague Carlin Morales, who is joining us here today, who is also helping with making sure that this webinar runs smoothly. So as questions come in and so forth, she'll be in the background, making sure that I'm paying attention to those. So, community science, we work with governments, we work with foundations, we work with nonprofit organizations on solutions to social problems. And we really do so with a systems change lens and always centering equity at the core of what we do. So this is actually a 3-part webinar series, as I mentioned previously, and it is being brought to you by the Organizational Effectiveness Practice Area at Community Science, where we really partner with mission-driven organizations to strengthen their capacity, their responsiveness, power, and impact. And we really see organizations as living organisms themselves and also as part of a larger ecosystem. And we believe deeply that organizations are always stronger when they center equity in what they do. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in and talk about why it is that we are here. So the landscape is shifting. We're in a moment right now across philanthropy and social change movements, really, where so many of us are trying to work differently. We're trying to be more trust-based, more collaborative, more grounded in relationships and lived experience. And this shift has been sort of in the works for some time now, but in some ways, the push has really been accelerated recently. And frankly, when everything is on fire, as seems to be these times, it's easy to get caught up in the overwhelm and the frenzy. But as a sector, as we mobilize away from transactional grant making and from sort of the rigid logic of return on investment, especially as philanthropy is eager to meet the moment, if we're leaning into nuance, if we're leaning into flexibility and complexity, how do we still stay grounded, right? How do we stay accountable to our purpose, to our communities, and to ourselves? And how do we know that we're on the right path? And that's really what today's conversation is about. How can we measure what really matters without getting lost in the weeds or being tethered to the wrong indicators? So the key, one key, I would say, is to remember that data is a flashlight. The data is not the endpoint. It is a tool to guide you through the unknown. So once upon a time in my former life, I was an academic and I taught research methods religiously for 100 years, and I lived it. And no one ever wanted to teach the class. It was a required course. Students sort of loathed it. And frankly, it was because they were scared of it. You know, they'd say, oh, but why do I need to learn this? And I'm not good at math. And I want to be a psychologist because I want to help people. Why do I need this? But for me, I love methods, and it's not because I love math, it's because it's a powerful tool to help people better, right? It's about coming up with clever ways to understand, to inform. So how can you help if you don't know what's wrong, or you don't know what's needed, or you don't know what matters, you don't know what's working, what's not, right? So my love of teaching methods was really about sharing that insight. I lived for those light bulb moments where you'd feel that resistance sort of melting into curiosity, right? There's nothing to be scared of. It's just a tool. It's a flashlight that helps guide you through the dark. So that said, we need to learn to use the tool wisely. Okay, so you may have heard this expression, what gets measured gets managed. It's a quote that's been attributed to various folks, Peter Drucker typically, and then there are wonderings if that's true. And often if you go back digging, it looks like it was likely V.F. Ridgway that made the point. But the issue remains, which is once you really start measuring something, that's sort of focused attention, right? And so when people pay a lot of attention to that metric and de facto not others, you can miss really important stuff, right? And the lesson there is that you better make sure that if you are measuring, you're measuring something that actually matters. And the problem is that we often can fall into some common traps. So let's talk a little bit about what those traps are that can distract, that can freeze, or that can mislead us. So the first one, we measure what's easy, right? We measure how many people went to a training or liked a training, but not whether that training actually mattered or whether it changed behavior or made a difference. Sometimes we measure too much, right? It's sort of this kitchen sink approach. One more question, one more, and then eventually we're drowning in data and we don't know what to prioritize or frankly what it tells us. And people can only hold on to so much information. And if everything is important, then nothing's important, right? And we see this one a lot, actually, this sort of data overwhelm, and it freezes folks. And there's so much data, by the time that they make sense of what to do with the data, it's no longer even relevant because the time has passed or the moment has moved on. So that's definitely one to pay attention to. We lock ourselves into rigid measures. And so we kind of miss real change that's happening in front of us. Again, it's that we stay so focused on this metric that we're not open to paying attention to other indicators that may be signaling, hey, change is afoot, right? Something's evolving in a slightly different way than maybe you had anticipated. Another one is that we spend too much time reporting or asking for metrics, that it drains the work. I'm sure folks can relate to this one, right? So you're prepping for this meeting, you're prepping for that meeting, you're collecting data, you're crunching data, and you're doing it in such short periods of time that you don't actually have time to do the work, right? So question becomes, what do we do, right? How do we avoid these sort of pitfalls? So here are some considerations and some offerings. I'm afraid that there's, no right answer. There's no sort of magic wand, but it's important to keep a few things in mind. The first is that context matters deeply. In the tundra, a good winter coat is essential. If you're in the tropics, that is just not at the top of the shopping list, right? So even though it would be great to always say X plus Y equals Z, that's the way you do it, it's not the way that works. Context really, really matters, right? And then the second consideration is that sometimes we need to slow down to speed up. And this is, I think, really hard. I catch myself falling into this trap sometimes where everything feels urgent and swirling, and we can lose our focus in that frenzy. And then when I personally feel that swirling, I have come to train myself. It's a signal, it's a data point, if you will, to breathe, to slow down, and to move with intention and purpose, right? Because ultimately, it's what prevents those missteps in the long run. So with those three considerations in mind, here are three questions that hopefully get you a little bit closer to using data effectively. So the first one is, what we're really trying to understand, right? Really thinking through what you need to know. So we worked with this one client that was clearly committed to using data. But the data collection process had sort of taken on a life of its own. Over time, the process had just multiplied. It had cauliflowered. And there was this very long survey. And while it was interesting, there was no clear why. So it wasn't clear. That is to say, it wasn't clear why knowing X about a particular set of people would change anything in terms of how the clients were approaching the work. And so ultimately, we ended up partnering with them to refine that data collection strategy and to make sure that the data that they gathered was truly meaningful and could generate insights that would actually drive decision making, that would change the way, if needed, this client was approaching the issue. Question 2, what would progress actually look like? What would it feel like? So in another example, we partnered with a foundation that was working to transform the early childhood education landscape at a systems level. And from the beginning, we worked with them to really co-create and operationalize their vision. And we did so with both quantitative and qualitative indicators of progress, as well as cross-referencing and cross-checking that with the grantees and so forth in the space. But another key to their success was their openness and their curiosity to really understand what progress looked like, and also using that data that we were collecting in real time to make tweaks, to make decisions, for example, to provide technical assistance or capacity building to grantees as needed so that the progress could continue to be realized. Last but certainly not least, who defines what matters, right? And are we actually listening? And so in our work with another foundation, we're seeking to understand best practices for inclusive decision making. There's definitely a literature that speaks to this, and we're working and learning from that literature, but we are also working and learning from those who are most proximate to the issues in their particular context. And context is always important, but in this particular project, it's really nuanced and critical to make sure that the voices of those who are typically divested or marginalized from this decision-making process get to define their version, right, of what meaningful inclusion looks like when we're doing this measurement. So those 3 questions are hopefully useful tools to think through how we can use data effectively. All right, the 3 horizons. So something to keep in mind with the answers to those questions that we just reviewed is that it really kind of depends where you are in the process of change. And so if you have been following this series, you've seen this slide before, the 3 horizons of change model. So the idea is that you have the first horizon, which is immediate. It's right now, it's what's in front of you, and it's sort of like what's urgent, right? And then you have the third horizon, which is that long-term vision, right? It's basically, it's why you're doing the work. It's the impact you want to have, and it's the why. And then you have the second horizon, which is often the hardest to sort of think through, right? It's the bridge. It's how you get there. How do you get from where you are now to that long-term goal and where you want to be? It's the how. And from a measurement perspective, you want to make sure that you're aligning the measurement with where you are in the horizon, right? And oftentimes the best way to do that is to backwards map, right? So you start with that third horizon. What do you want to build? What are you working towards? And then think backwards. What are the signals that would suggest that you're on your way? What would help you course correct if you needed to, right? So there's now what's emerging, really early signs. Horizon 2, sort of soon, it's all relative, but in the middle, what are the patterns? What are the relationships? What are the culture shifts? And then last, you're working towards that third horizon, which is deep change, which is typically policy, institutional change, systemic change as well. So When we're thinking about those three horizons, so we're thinking about sort of, okay, these are the questions, the framework that I'm applying, and I'm thinking about how do I apply that in this context of thinking through time. Some other things really to keep in mind. Change is not linear, and it doesn't happen at a constant rate of acceleration, right? So folks might typically think of this kind of line graph when people think, okay, increase over time. But rarely is that how change happens, right? So think of the notion of things like tipping points. A lot has to happen oftentimes to tip the scale, which frankly looks a whole lot more either like an S curve, right? So slow, 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 and then eventually you get a tip and then you get a plateau. Or sometimes we see exponential growth as well, right? So the idea is that we have to be really nimble and thoughtful in the process of figuring out what to measure, because we don't know before it happens what the shape's going to look like. And it really depends on place and time, what you're going to see. And if you go looking for linear though, chances are you're not going to find it. It's not, I mean, it's not de facto, but chances are you won't. And so tomorrow it's different than 6 months. It's different from 10 years from now. And I'd actually like to share what I think is a really nice real world example. This was a data visualization put together by Tribu and Collins. I may have said that name incorrectly. In case I apologize if I did, but from Bloomberg Business, and they created these data visualizations that look at the rate of change for social policy issues in the US. And what I love about this graph, so various issues, you have interracial marriage, prohibition, women's suffrage, et cetera, et cetera. What I love about the graph is that you see a few things really clearly. So first, you see that depending on the issue, that the rate of change looks very different, right? So clearly context matters. Change doesn't always look exactly the same. You also see some nice examples of some S curves. You see some nice examples of some exponential stuff. You don't see too much linear going on, but I think it really is a nice underscoring of this idea that that change, it depends, right? And so some things even go up, or rather go down before they go up, right? Things get worse before they improve in terms of thinking through your metrics. So again, all in the context of really being open to what the pattern of change is, how it's going to unfold. So something else to keep in mind. There are subsystems that are also changing at different rates, right? So organizations are not monolithic. There's sort of the rate of change of the whole organization, but then within an organization, there are these subunits, right? These subsystems. So for example, you have individual departments, you have different organizational functions, and they also have their own rate of change, right? These nested systems. And so you may have one department that's going 20 miles an hour, you have another that's going 45 miles an hour, and you have one department that cannot turn on the engine, right? So keeping in mind that you have the whole unit, but even within the system that you're studying, if it's an organization or that you're working with, there's other things going on below the surface that are potentially moving at different rates. And last, but definitely not least, is this, we like to use this expression that the runway is long. It's really a truism that we see when we're working with a lot of clients. So we get in and we realize that on-ramp, those building blocks, they take a long time to set up, to lay the groundwork. And for anyone on the front lines who's actually doing this work, y'all probably know this pretty well, right? And the key is that your measurement strategy has to be attuned to this. So another once upon a time story, I was part of this multi-year organizational change initiative. And for the first year, we were laying groundwork. It took a year to meet with all the different stakeholders, with all the different groups, to discuss issues from their perspective, to get buy-in, to do all the things, right? And some of it kind of felt invisible, right? If you were measuring our end goal, our end KPI, if you will, which was culture change, which was what we were working towards, there's no way it would have showed up. But that relationship and awareness building was critical. We would have had a huge organizational initiative that would have never taken off because it would have been tone deaf, or it just would have been launched in a vacuum. So that whole year was really crucial to building the bridges that we needed to launch phase 2 and phase 3, which eventually did lead us to those KPIs, which was what we were working towards. But again, the point of the story is to be realistic, that change takes time, and that the rate of change really is important in thinking through our various measurement strategies. So as we round out the conversation today, so this is sort of the last content slide, if you will, I want us to consider one more quandary. And I imagine this is a situation that will resonate with many of you. It's what we in the OE team have been calling the head-heart decisions, right? You want to do it all, you have limited resources. I think many of us can probably relate to that. And so then the question from a measurement perspective becomes, how do you use data to make those really hard decisions? So we recently worked with a client where that was precisely the question, right? This organization was trying to figure out how to maximize this impact of a pretty limited resource for the most needy in their community. And historically, with this particular context, this had translated over time into spreading the funding more broadly. So they wanted to make sure that everybody got something, but as the number of requests grew, the amount that any one person might get, or one org or initiative might get, decreased. So when we started to engage with multiple stakeholders in the ecosystem, we really started to look at data holistically. And what we found was that this very well-intentioned approach was really diluting impact rather than driving change. And so in the end, what we did was we really focused on defining what was essential in their particular context, right? And once we were able to figure out what was important for this group of folks, we really helped to reimagine what meaningful equity-driven investment might look like. So instead of spreading those resources thinly, they're now considering some recommendations for making more strategic, more high-impact funding decisions that serve the most underserved communities. And so as we wrap up, right, thinking through, that's really the goal, right? When I started, I said, one of the key takeaways, data is a tool. That's exactly right. So the question becomes, how can we use data in a thoughtful way, not just to collect data for data's sake, but rather so that we can use it as a tool, so that when we are in the dark and we don't know how to proceed, we can use our flashlight, right? And thinking through again that how I use the tool is going to depend on where I am in the process. You know, what do I need to know now? What do I think is happening next? And what do we hope to see? And so with that, I am happy to take any questions that folks may have. And I thank you for your time.
As people are thinking, the first one would be, what are some useful practices to account for personal bias when contextualizing data in the analysis and reporting section?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because we all have them, right? The personal bias is a very real thing. I think that being aware of them is really critical, clearly. And then also to the extent that when you're engaging in these measurement strategies, that you are working very much in community with other stakeholders to make sure that you are collecting data in a way not only that is useful in terms of how you are seeing it, but also in the way that they too are seeing it. So really using a participatory approach and doing that from the beginning as much as possible. So that means involving folks from the beginning in data collection. So when you're thinking about what to measure, when you're thinking through how to collect that data, what are the best strategies for collecting that data, and then also for making sense of the data as well. So I'll quote my colleague Jasmine. She likes to say, we don't like to be right. We want to get it right. And one of the ways that we can make sure that we are getting it right is to check our assumptions. And so oftentimes we go back to folks that we have worked with and said, hey, here's what we heard. Is this resonating with you, to make sure that in fact we have gotten it right? So hopefully that provides a bit of context.
Yes, and we actually have a hand up from one of our attendees, Sharon, if you would like to share your question.
One of the things that I really love is working with communities, particularly as it relates to people's lived experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess maybe about 20, if not 35 years ago, Robert Wood Johnson did or had a series of really helping community investors, what I call them, and people who live in the community to really kind of understand research. And then, because of funding interest, it kind of went away. But are there any suggested user-friendly software that you have found that has been works well with communities with diverse strengths as well as challenges? Because I really think along the way, I feel like sometimes our research is like a foreign language. And once we leave, how are they continuing to interpret or build upon some of that information? So thank you so much. I guess you all will mute me so I can get the response to
Oh, well, thank you for that question, Sharon. I really appreciate it. It's a great question. So I agree with you wholeheartedly, right? So when we're thinking through sort of centering the experience of our communities, we want to make sure that it's not just in an extractive way, right? That we are providing resources in terms of folks taking ownership of their own sort of data and knowledge and continuing to build upon that. You asked about some software. I don't know that I have a software platform per se recommendation, but I do think that there are some tools. And actually, we have one that when we sort of that talks through, what is a logic model, and sort of talks a little bit about the basics of what research can look like, and breaks it down in it doesn't have to be technical, right? I think that that when folks get beyond the jargon, it's something that everyone can resonate with, right? Just collecting information to make better decisions. So we could certainly include that at the tail end of this sort of 3-part series. We'll send out an FAQ and we can send that link along, no problem.
Thank you.
Of course.
That was very helpful, because I think that is it. It's just like when we have to become familiar with their language and how they operationalize terms, that exchange should be bi-directional and not from a hierarchical perspective. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. I appreciate you.
Next question could be drilling into the how. What approaches have you used that help teams develop indicators that really matter?
Yeah, it's a great question. So drilling into the how is oftentimes we don't do it alone. So we really do take the time to work with our clients, and we sometimes use community advisory boards, so on and so forth, to yes, use what we know, but also to make sure that we are working with folks with whom we are trying to serve. And so having a conversation in terms of thinking about not what do I think change would look like in your community? What do you think change would look like in your community? What do you think it would feel like? So it's really about that participatory co-creation process. And you can collect that data in multiple ways. It can be in stages. It can be through a survey. It can be through focus groups. One of the things I think that's important is that, data collection is not often a one and done, right? But we take the time to collect some data, have it feed into our process in some sort of way, and then go back, see if we need a little bit more, maybe a round 2, refine, so on and so forth. And so I think that that is one possibility. And then also, you don't always have to reinvent the wheel, right? So I do think that there is merit and value at looking at previous approaches, what indicators have potentially worked well, and then building upon that, right? Using that sort of expansive mindset rather than always sort of insular and closing.
Do you have in mind any specific metrics for those who are supporting lending and technical assistance to both small businesses and real estate developers?
I don't know that I have a commonly recommended metric for that specific context. I would have to think about that, and then perhaps we can add that to the FAQ after we have a moment to percolate that. But nothing off the top of my head comes to mind. I see another one here. So now that I've actually found the box, the one about, can you talk a little bit about navigating between quantitative and qualitative data? We all know that quant doesn't capture the nuances of what all is actually happening, but qualitative data is hard to quantify and show overall impact. But when we do that, it flattens out the nuances. What to do? Great question. I think it's a both and, to be quite honest. I truly believe that there is merit and value in both. And so if there is space and capacity to have those quant indicators with the contextualization of the qualitative, I think that that's the best of both worlds. I also think that depending on who you're speaking to, the data, certain data is more compelling to certain kinds of folks, right? And so to the extent that that's also true, I think that there's value in not capturing. I think that there is value in trying to get both and seeing how they can play together, right? It's the both and instead of the either or. So that would be my recommendation, and that is typically our approach. I have not done something solely quant or quantitative in quite a long time, and I was trained as very much as a quantitative person, but I see tremendous value in making sure that we have the context right. So both. So I don't know if other folks are able to see the question. So I don't know if, no, they're not. Okay. So another question. As a funder of, forgive me, funder of intermediary funders and technical assistance providers, what are the best approaches to balancing how to ask for the right data from the intermediary about outputs and outcomes from both the intermediary and the end beneficiary? Well, best approaches for balancing. I mean, I do think that there's something to be said for really taking that. What do you need? What do you need to know? Right. So I do think that there is something to be said for have to know versus nice to know. And again, I do think that that's a function of I think that's a function of what you're trying to accomplish. And so if you are in a capacity building perspective, the question is, I think oftentimes what we want to know is it working, right? So what are the 1 or 2 or 3 things that you can ask to figure out whether or not your approach is working and or if there needs to be tweaks. I do think that there really is something that is beneficial to reimagining data as something that's feeding into a continuous decision-making process rather than just this static thing that we use. And so if you reframe in that light, hopefully that can help narrow the problem space. Because what you also don't want to do is fall into that trap of asking for more. And then it creates an issue where you can't even make space to get the work done in the first place. So a little bit of attention here. We had someone who had asked about how to make competing entities play nicely in the sandbox. when it comes to mapping data elements and sharing definitions. And I think that it's a really excellent question. I think we are now in a moment of collective collective movement, all trying to hopefully work towards the same thing. And so then the question becomes, how can we reframe our work rather than this sort of zero-sum kind of competitive game? How can we reframe it as working towards the collective, the collective good? And there is certainly plenty of work to be done to get us there. And so I think really recasting and reframing that collective goal. What is it that we are all trying to work towards is a useful first step. And I think that hoarding data or hoarding information really doesn't do anyone any good in the long term. And so thinking through ways of recasting and also potentially carving out space so that folks have their pieces of the collective pie, if you will, is also another thing to think through. There is another question about asking about how to track racial wealth gaps. So knowing it's difficult to track how racial wealth gaps are measured, what are ways to track proxy data and what publicly available resources are out there to try to track them in to track wealth gaps in communities. I don't have off the top of my head, I have some databases that I've worked with, but I don't want to give incorrect information. That's something we can also make sure that we attend to in the context of the FAQ when we do our follow-up. I will take this then as our opportunity to say thank you. Thank you so much for joining today. If you had an opportunity to join my colleagues, that's wonderful. And if you haven't, I know that there are recordings, so you can listen to those wise folks talk about their perspectives as well. And by all means, if you're anything like me, you hang up or you get off a call and you think, oh, I had that one extra question. Please feel free to reach out. Happy to hear from you. Haynes-Baratz at communityscience.com. We will follow up with a recording and some FAQs as well, post this webinar. And with that, I say thank you very much.